Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Blake Johnson. Theresa, Cardinal Brown, and I will dedicate the first part of this episode to commemorate the 20th anniversary of 9/11. How did the terrorist attacks pave the way for our current immigration system, and how were things before that fateful day? We'll then turn to the latest on Capitol Hill, where we'll review the Democrats' immigration reform plan meant to be included in the reconciliation package. Can it pass the Senate parliamentarian? She's already pushed back on Democrats for more details. So, what is in the immigration plan, and what can we expect with reconciliation in the coming months? We'll get the skinny with BPC Action's Managing Director, Laura Hull. All of this to come, so stick around. On September 11, 2021, we commemorated the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. To talk about that fateful day and how the attacks have impacted U.S. immigration policy, let's bring in BPC regular Theresa Cardinal Brown, who you can also find at BPC_T Brown on Twitter. Theresa, welcome back.
Hi, Blake.
It's certainly a very sensitive subject for a lot of us. Back to what happened in 2001, it obviously changed the direction for so many of us and for the country as a whole. What can you tell us about that day and where you were and what you remember about it?
Yeah, so in 2001, I was working at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I was already probably, 7 or 8 years into my immigration career by that time. And anybody familiar with Washington, D.C. may know that the building for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is literally across Lafayette Park from the White House. So we're very close there. And frequently when we were working in the building, there were Secret Service people who would come in periodically, other engagements of security, just because we're that close to the White House. But I remember that day, I was obviously had been working in immigration and border policy at the chamber, and we were having a staff meeting, and somebody came into the meeting and said, something's happening in New York, something hit the towers, turn on the news. And so we all, of course, did that. And as I recall it, as we were watching the news, or shortly thereafter, when we were trying to figure out what was going on, somebody looked out one of the windows facing the White House and saw smoke coming up from the west and said, I think there's something happened on the mall, because we didn't know exactly where it was. There was smoke that we saw coming up behind the Eisenhower Executive Office building, which is right next to the White House. And none of us really knew what was going on, but it wasn't that long before then that we knew there had been terrorist attacks in Tokyo, for example. We had heard that things were happening in other parts of the world, and so our minds started immediately racing. By the time the second plane hit the towers in New York, everyone was aware that this was an attack of some kind. And I just remember a colleague of mine, a good friend of mine, who looked at me and said, "You have 2 young kids at home. What are you waiting for? Leave." He was very afraid that I would get stuck away from my kids. So I left kind of before we even realized what was happening, before the major evacuations from DC. And I had ridden the metro into DC. And I remembered riding the metro back home to find my kids at their school and thinking the entire time about the sarin gas attack in the Tokyo subway and praying that I would live. That day and the next couple of days, we didn't really know exactly what had happened or how it would impact. It's, sort of over the next weeks and months, we realized, who were the perpetrators? How did they get to the country? All of those kinds of things. But I think most of us realized that something very significant had changed, obviously in terms of the United States, but those of us working on immigration policy, had that dread that, this was going to very much change things for the future.
Well, and on that, at the time you were working as an immigration policy director, and then you were involved in the debates over the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. What were your main recollections about, the key immigration issues, sort of before and after that, and how that sort of changed?
Yeah. So one thing it's worth remembering is that for many years before 9/11, there had been discussion about merging the border agencies. So before 9/11, the Immigration Naturalization Service, which was part of the Department of Justice, and the Customs Service, which was part of the Treasury Department, worked alongside each other at the border. So, for example, if you drove up to a land border, you might get a person in a white shirt at a booth, that would be an immigration officer, or a person in a blue shirt at a booth, and that would be a customs officer. They were both, adjudicating your entry to the United States, kind of looking for different things, somewhat cross designated. But there was also calls within the immigration community to break up INS, feeling that the enforcement part of INS was overshadowing the benefits part of INS, and that if they separated, then maybe more attention would be paid for the benefits part. So immigration advocates and people, border facilitation people, and lots of different people had ideas about a unified border inspection agency and breaking up the INS long before 9/11 happened. And then as more and more started coming out about what happened in 9/11, particularly as the 9/11 Commission report on terrorist travel came out, and it really pointed out how the terrorists managed to come into the United States and stay, and false documents and foreign student visas, it became clear that they had managed to find all of the security loopholes in our immigration service to enter and stay in the United States, on top of the perceived intelligence failures of failing to, put the pieces together, as they said, connect the dots at the time. There was an overwhelming feeling that we needed to put more of a security focus on our immigration system, close those, I won't say loopholes in the law. They were more loopholes in practice. I mean, the immigration service was primarily paper-based. They didn't have access to a lot of databases. They weren't connected very well with the intelligence community for lookouts and things like that, or even law enforcement. So all of these were things that were seen as places that needed to be fixed. And Congress then started this idea of creating a new department that would merge lots of different parts of the federal government apparatus to protect the homeland. And this idea that had existed before about creating a single border agency and dividing the enforcement parts of INS from the benefits parts of INS became a core idea in the immigration functions being put under the new Department of Homeland Security. There were lots of debates in Congress about it. One of the biggest ones is that all the committees that had jurisdiction over the various agencies didn't want to give up their jurisdiction. At the end of the day, there was a select committee in the House that was put together that was made up basically of the chairs of all the committees of all the various agencies that were being thrown into the DHS pot, if you will, that kind of decided what would go in and what would go out. But there were specific things in the Homeland Security Act in 2003 that were related to the immigration functions of INS, and very, very, very famously, for anybody who worked in immigration at that time, was a single line that said the Immigration and Naturalization Service is hereby abolished. And it put the agencies, Customs and Border Protection, Immigration Customs Enforcement, USCIS, as they became known, as part of this new Department of Homeland Security.
Well, so obviously that has heavily influenced, just how we've come to view immigration and, the use of DHS as that sort of function, acting not just simply as a processor, but as sort of an additional law enforcement and protective service for our borders. Being in those years afterwards, obviously, every day was, what was the terror threat warning level at? Were we at orange, or were we at yellow? And for those who weren't around during that period, like it was very anxiety inducing for everybody. So, and then what impact did that have, I guess, on U.S. immigration policy, and how we've come to view that debate, I think.
Yeah. So it's important to understand that as the Department of Homeland Security was stood up in 2003, and all of these various agencies came together and kind of reformatted, in the first few years, it was very common walking around the halls of DHS, which I joined in 2005, so not that long after it was formed, to walk around the halls of DHS, and people would ask, what was your legacy agency? In other words, where did you come from before you got here, right? And so I was legacy INS, I was legacy Customs, I was legacy Coast Guard, I was legacy Treasury, whatever. So it wasn't still one agency, but everybody was sort of pushed together. But the overarching mission set and value set, and I would say cultural creation of that department, was the never again mantra. Never again would the United States allow foreign terrorists to come onto US soil and perpetrate such attacks. And that mission overrode every other mission that became part of the Department of Homeland Security. And, yes, by dividing, if you will, the old Immigration and Naturalization Service and putting the benefits over at USCIS and the enforcement eventually into two agencies. It was originally created to be one, but two agencies, ICE and CBP. To some extent, USCIS lost that sort of law enforcement focus, but they still understood that in processing applications, they had to pay attention to those things that might mean that somebody was not who they said they were. So they created a fraud detection and national security directorate at USCIS to embed that in their process. But then the law enforcement components of INS were also decoupled from the benefits side and free to fully invest in their law enforcement security missions. That especially was true of the US Border Patrol, who always felt themselves as sort of a paramilitary type organization in law enforcement, with an important mission to secure the border. And that just sort of ramped up substantially. And within CBP, even in the border adjudication side, I think the customs culture sort of overran whatever was the legacy INS culture. So that culture was more about stopping drugs, about stopping contraband, less about, sort of processing people for benefits. And so I do think that was the culture on which DHS was formed. Now, over the years and various administrations, that has waxed and waned, but I think that's still true throughout DHS, even if the mission is shifted from terrorism to criminal activity and drug smuggling and gangs. There's still an overarching law enforcement culture that I think permeates certainly the immigration functions of DHS, and I think a lot of the rest of the agencies as well.
Well, and getting back to more of just the getting away, I guess, from that need to be a law enforcement agency side. There's lots of conversations about, does DHS need serious reforms? Particularly, we have a lot of members of Congress and advocates calling for the abolish of ICE. Is that something that needs to be reformed? Is it broken? What sort of changes do we need to be thinking about? And as far as you see, having both worked inside and been on the outside for a little while now, what do you think needs to change?
I think definitely it's an agency that is maybe even overdue for some serious sort of evaluation externally. And I think that's important because remember when I said that at the time when DHS was formed, none of the committees of jurisdiction wanted to give up jurisdiction over the agencies that they previously oversaw. They never changed that. Congress never fixed that. They created Homeland Security committees in both the House and the Senate, but those committees don't oversee all of the parts of DHS. When it comes to immigration, judiciary committees in the House and the Senate still retain oversight over all of the immigration and many of the border issues. Because of the legacy customs missions, the Ways and Means Committee and the Finance Committee and the Senate still have jurisdiction over parts of what CBP does. So you have this dilution of oversight from Congress, and there hasn't been, I think, as much external scrutiny and oversight of how the department functioned. Congress, for the first decade of DHS's existence, was more than happy to just give it a lot more money to do its job. And even though the agency in the first 7-8 years, went through several different restructurings and reorganizations, how it was fulfilling its missions was less really understood. Those reorganizations, I think a lot were about internal management structures for the department and some internal battling about who all gets to report to the secretary, right? Nobody wants to be demoted to reporting to somebody else and then reporting to the secretary. Everybody wanted to report directly to the secretary. So it's got a very flat reporting structure. And various sort of intra-agency battles between the jurisdiction that DHS was given and what jurisdictions other departments maintain, particularly with Department of Justice and Department of State. A lot of that sort of focused the agency at the time. And they were so internally focused on all those things that I think the external oversight and evaluation was not as substantial as it could have been. And that essentially, along with a ton of money thrown at the department, meant that they pretty much did things the way they wanted to do with very little accountability. And I think that's really the crux of it. If Congress were to streamline its jurisdiction and really take responsibility for overseeing the Department of Homeland Security, it should be subject to annual authorization bills like the Defense Department is. But it's not. It's not had an authorization bill pass the House and the Senate and be enacted into law since its founding, even though it has annual appropriations. So, in fact, the appropriators probably have the most influence on the department rather than any authorizing committees. I don't think Department of Homeland Security needs to be abolished. I don't think ICE and CBP necessarily need to be abolished, but I do think we need to think seriously about how we look at the missions, that culture that developed that put law enforcement over everything. Is that still appropriate? As we look at what threats have changed and evolved since 9/11, I mean, we had a pretty much insular sole focus on foreign terrorist attacks, particularly foreign, Islamist terrorist attacks, for want of a better term. And now we're seeing more threats develop from inside the United States, whether it be from domestic extremists of any ideology or sort. Cybersecurity was barely a blip that we thought about back in 2003. We have a lot more work for organization like FEMA to do, both in terms of responding to natural disasters, but also responding to other crises like at the border. So I do think it's overdue for a broad-based mission reset and some accountability. And I think that's ultimately Congress's job, to figure out how to do that.
Would you think that it would need to be broken out, sort of, you talk about the culture and stuff like that, between the law enforcement side and sort of the processing and immigration side?
I don't think that there's necessarily a pro or con to either of that. I don't think necessarily linking them back up would soften one side or bolden the other side. I think it's much more about who's holding them accountable for the actions they have and the policies they put in place and the implementation of those policies. And if there's really nobody outside the organization that is sort of making them be transparent, making them account for their actions, the way they spend their money, all of those kinds of things, it allows those cultures that can, frankly, breed people who have less respect for the other missions of the department, or less respect for, frankly, obeying the norms to flourish. And I think that's where we've seen a lot of challenges. And there can be new leadership that can come in and try to make those changes, but those have been, that culture is pretty deep now, 20 years in. And I think it's going to take some pretty strong action to change that substantially.
Nope. Thank you, Theresa, for your reflections on that. For our next segment, we turn to Capitol Hill, where Congress is inching closer to finalizing its budget reconciliation package. This week, the House Judiciary Committee approved the immigration language for the upcoming package on a 25-19 party line vote after turning down many Republican amendments. To talk about what is in the proposal and make sense of the language, let's ask Sadikshya Nepal, BPC Immigration Fellow, who you can follow on Twitter at SADIKSHYA_Nepal, NEPAL, and we'll also be joined by Laura Hall, Managing Director of BPC Action. Welcome to you both.
Hi, Blake.
Hi, happy to be here.
Sadikshya, let's turn to you first. Can you give us a little scoop about what's in the immigration language for the package? What do you think would benefit most if this if this passes? What's the big benefit?
Yeah, it's been very awaited, right? We've been waiting to see what was going to be included in the package for the parliamentarian, and so this gives us a little scoop of what's in there. Some of the stuff which would allow legalization for huge mass of the population. Dreamers are included in that. So dreamers, anyone who've been in the US and have a continuous presence here since January 2021, who meet certain education requirement or requirement of being in the armed forces, have had earned income prior to filing the application. These folks are naturally could have a pathway towards legalization. We also have TPS holders who have a lot of immigration advocates have come forward and showed support for anyone with a continuous presence here for the last 3 years and who received TPS designation status on January 1st, 2017 would qualify for legalization. Interestingly, we don't have the farm workers bill in the language. However, we do have a stipulation for essential workers, anyone who's had continued presence here since January 1st, 2021, but those who have also demonstrated a consistent record of earned income and who would qualify for an essential occupation as defined by DHS. During the COVID era, they came up with a list of occupations that would be considered essential. Anybody in home health or regular health or retail for pharmacy. So anybody who are involved in occupations such as these would qualify. We have some grounds of ineligibility. So anybody who would not meet grounds under criminal, if they had a criminal record, or security-related grounds, or those who have violated their student visa provisions, those people would not qualify. But, health-related grounds, public charge, labor certification violation, that is not counted under grounds of ineligibility. There are some waivers for populations that they could apply, and those are adjudicated case by case basis. So this is pretty comprehensive. We not only have legalizations for those who've been in the U.S. in an undocumented status. The language also has some visa capture mechanisms. So for the family-based immigrants, starting in fiscal year 2022, there is a visa capturing for anybody from fiscal year of 1992 up until 2021. Any of those unused visas will be captured and processed. It's also permanently going to amend the Immigration and Nationality Act to set the annual floor for the family-based visas to $226,000 plus any of the unused visas. Similarly, employment-based immigration is also going to get a temporary increase starting in FY 2022. Unused visas from fiscal year 1992 up until this year is going to be implemented going forward. Though the visa capture for the employment-based visas are not ongoing like it is for family-based visas. So any of the unused employment-based visas are always going to be then recaptured within the family-based category. Diversity visa lottery winners are getting a second chance. Any diversity visa lottery winners from 2017 to 2021 who could not enter the country due to some restrictions, are going to have the ability to reapply. We're also providing adjustment of statuses for anyone who have been petitioned approved for a green card, can apply to adjust status if they pay a supplemental fee of $1,500. We have the EB1 and EB2 categories whose priority date are more than 2 years before filing for the adjustment status, can pay another $5,000 of supplemental fee and adjust status. The family-based petitions who have had a priority for more than 2 years can also adjust status with a supplemental fee of $2,500. So as you can see that I'm trying to kind of touch on all of these different adjustments, all of these different legalization provisions that are within the reconciliation package, and it's quite robust. This is just the surface of it, and we have to wait and see how the parliamentarian is still going to rule. But so far, it looks like most of the things that we could not get from a comprehensive immigration reform package that was introduced earlier this year, or all of these small bipartisan bills that have been introduced in Congress, anything that has not moved forward, have been included in this language as much as the advocates and as much as the groups can get. So we have to wait and see how it's going to evolve.
So on this, it sounds like it's going to affect just a very large number of people who, and this is about mostly changing their status, moving them forward. So Theresa, I just want to go back to you real quick. Thanks for being with us as well. This immigration reform set, and I put reform in quotes here, right? How does this compare to previous comprehensive immigration packages? And what do you think this will do for reform efforts in the future?
Yeah. So as Sadikshya described it, the bulk of these provisions, the immigration provisions, are about legalizing people who have been in the country either in an undocumented status or in like DACA recipients or TPS holders. Probably the broadest provision is actually the essential worker provision, because that list of occupations that DHS named as essential probably includes 2/3 of the workforce. It covers every possible industry. Financial services workers were considered essential. IT services workers were considered essential. So that could mean a lot of H-1B people in the employment-based backlog who have current status could theoretically apply for a green card under these provisions. There's no requirement that you be in an unauthorized or undocumented status to apply. Just the undocumented population that's estimated to be able to apply for legalization under that provision is about 8 million people. If you add in the potential legal people who could also apply, that could be another 500,000. We just don't exactly know. The visa recapture provisions could add another 500,000 visas a year over the next several years as they recapture those. So these provisions would clear out a lot of the immigration backlogs that we've been talking about on this podcast and others for people who have approved petitions, are trying to come in legally, and just have to wait because of various caps. What's missing from previous comprehensive packages is any fundamental reform of the underlying immigration system. And this is where what you said about reform in quotes matters, because it's not really reforming the immigration system. It is providing relief for people who have not been able to go through the existing immigration system. It's relief or remediation, if you will, of people who have been harmed by the way the system has worked in the past, whether they're undocumented or have been waiting in long lines. But there's no real fundamental change to the system itself. And I think that's a very important missing part, because past efforts at comprehensive immigration reform really included robust changes to the legal immigration system going forward. That was a second equally important pillar to whatever legalization provisions were in there. And in almost every previous attempt, there were enforcement provisions, either provisions for border security or interior enforcement. The idea was we don't want to have periodic, broad-scale legalization programs as the norm, because that means that our system has continued to fail, that we continue to have to do that. So I do think that it's a missed opportunity. It certainly limits the opportunities for bipartisanship. Now, as we said, reconciliation is a partisan process by design. So they didn't have to necessarily negotiate on those other pieces. But I think it is a failing, because although it may provide relief and certainly progress for a lot of people who've been waiting a long time for this, it really doesn't, I think, do what we need to do for the United States to have a really strong, robust immigration system that we can all support, that can support the United States and our economy and our society going forward. And I think that's a missed opportunity.
Well, I want to go ahead and bring in Laura Hall here. Laura, the big question now, the Senate parliamentarian, what hurdles still exist here? And now that we have some language, what do you think about it? What's your impression? Is this going to pass? Is this going to get through her approval process?
Thanks, Blake. I think the policy is one side of what we have kind of going on here, but the other side, I would normally say politics, but now it's really procedural. Procedural is the hurdle we have to kind of cross now. Everything that Sadikshya and Theresa outlined could potentially be in a bill. We do not know what a final bill is going to look like. There's a few reasons we don't know that. The Senate parliamentarian is one. Reconciliation, just the rules that kind of go around reconciliation. One of the main rules is that reconciliation, the big word that people kind of chop off sometimes is budget reconciliation. This package, this tool is intended to be used for the budgetary process. Everything that is in legislation on reconciliation needs to have a budgetary implication. It needs to spend money or it needs to somehow make money. I think folks that have argued that the immigration provisions could be included argue that they do have budgetary implications. At the end of the day, the ruling of the Senate parliamentarian, who is a nonpartisan kind of caller of balls and strikes, her and her team are going to have to be the ones that make that decision at the end of the day. So provided, and it could be a situation where all the provisions are cleared by the parliamentarian for inclusion, some of the provisions are cleared by the parliamentarian for inclusion, or none of the provisions are cleared by the parliamentarian for inclusion. Depending on how that goes, we also have the matter of just, I'll bring politics back into it now. The Senate, even though we do have a Democratic majority over there as well, is just on balance a lot more conservative than the House of Representatives. They have a narrower margin in order to get something done. And a lot of their members maybe don't have as much of an inclination to take a more progressive stance on immigration as some of the House members do. So not only do we have to make sure that this language passes muster with the parliamentarian, that we can get enough votes in the Senate to advance the bill and move it forward. I think it's also worth noting that, we're obviously very focused on immigration in this space, but there are so many things in this bill that are priorities for President Biden, Speaker Pelosi, the Democratic caucus. At the end of the day, if there has to be a situation where, hey, we trim this out to keep this in, or we'll narrow this down because we got to really keep this in, we haven't seen the cards yet to know what are some of the things that might be on kind of the negotiating table and what are some of the things that have to stay in no matter what. So I think there's still a bit of a ways to go on this bill.
Yeah, it sounds like, there's been just the jockeying that's going on, between members, not only over just like whose priorities are more important, which things stay in and out, what are the top priorities for the administration. Members have their own hangups. And on top of that, we've also seen some members, especially in the Senate, have said, and I think just this week, Senator Sinema was up at the White House to go and speak with Biden and his team about her priorities for this legislation. A lot of people have made issues with the top number, and do they try and negotiate together to get that number down, and what has to be cut to meet that scoring scenario. So where do you think the priorities for the administration, I guess, are right now?
I think you made a lot of good points, and I think you're exactly right. The jockeying is still continuing. This is going to be flipped, but at the end of the day, I think the administration wants a bill that'll pass. And I think they're doing some of these conversations now to figure out what those must-haves are. And is it some of the immigration things I talked about? Is it paid family leave? Is it healthcare provisions and things like that? All these things are in the package. And I think they're having these conversations significantly behind the scenes with Sinema and others, figuring out, where they can find the alignment within their caucus and where they might be able to get those votes together. I think at the end of the day, passing something is more important to them than what necessarily is in the package. A lot of these things are Democratic priorities. I think it'd be exciting for Biden and others if a lot of these things got over the finish line. I'm not sure they're going to pick a favorite child at this point, but we'll see as the days go on if maybe they start leaning in behind any one provision a little bit more than the others.
So sort of getting to the point where they need a win, and being all in the same party, they're not ready to go and throw the administration or the House or the Senate, throw each other under the bus, because that at the end of the day, they need to show strength. Is that the...
Yeah. I think the negotiations are still in private at this point. I don't think you want to put some of the things out in public that might kind of hamstring some of your efforts, but believe me, they're all talking to each other and they're all trying to work this out behind closed doors.
Well, while they're trying to work that up behind closed doors, there's another massive budget issue that needs to be taken care of, and that's going to be the continuing resolution. The new fiscal year starts October 1st, so we're back to speculating about the CR and when that's going to happen. So Congresses and their staffs are going to stay pretty busy through the end of the year here. The White House has sent to Congress its list of priorities and what it would like to have included, and some of those issues do include immigration. So Theresa, what has the White House asked for regarding immigration in the CR?
Yeah, so they've actually asked for a lot of different things in the continuing resolution with regard to immigration. Just a couple of highlights. They have asked for money to reimburse local jurisdictions along the border that have been taking care of COVID testing and vaccinations for immigrants that are apprehended by CBP and then released into the communities. They have asked for authority to be able to move money around within the department to cover expenses, for example, for reunifying families that were separated under the Trump administration's child separation activities, and to provide them with supplemental services. A big chunk of money is asking $342 million for USCIS to basically address its existing application backlog and what's expected to be an increase in applications from the resettled Afghan evacuees. There's monies being asked specifically for the Afghan evacuees who have been provided humanitarian parole to give them access to the same sort of financial, medical, job assistance and living assistance supports that actual refugees are entitled to. Otherwise, under a current State Department program, they would only get about 90 days of help and then would be completely on their own in the United States. So there's a lot of that kind of money that's asked in there. But there is also a specific provision that would legally affect the Afghan evacuees. There is a provision that is asking Congress to pass a authorization that would allow those who have been brought into the United States as parolees to receive to apply for green cards within 1 year after arrival without having to formally apply for asylum. This kind of adjustment is very similar to what Cuban nationals have received for most of the last half century under the Cuban Adjustment Act, whereby Cubans who came to the United States, arrived on U.S. soil, were given parole for a year, and within a year could apply directly for a green card without having to go through an asylum application process. And so the request is to allow the Afghan evacuees to do the same. Now, I will specify this is not without undergoing screening and vetting of some sort. It is, they still have to undergo all the other security checks and be shown to be otherwise admissible to the United States as green card holders, but it would mean that they wouldn't have to supplementally apply for actual asylum in the United States. So there's quite a few items that the administration is asking of Congress, basically saying, don't just continue our existing authorizations and appropriations from last year because we've got all these other things that we are dealing with that we didn't plan for. And so if you don't give us this extra money, essentially we'd be asking for it in some sort of supplemental anyway. So please let us have this extra money and authorities.
And Laura, so among these requests that Theresa just outlined, what has the best path for inclusion in a continuing resolution? After figuring out what actually could make it in to a CR, what other deadlines does Congress have on its plate that they're having to juggle right now? I'm going to throw one word out or two words out: debt limit, as something that is getting a lot of attention right now. The Republicans seem to be fully aligned against, and Democrats are trying to make the appeal that this needs to be bipartisan, but that's also causing a lot of consternation within the rank and file. How is that going to impact things as far as what needs to get rolled in together and complicated, as you can probably lay out better than I can?
Well, We have a traffic jam, Blake. We have between now in the next couple of weeks, we have a lot of things that either have to get done or leadership has promised will get done. I mean, we have obviously spent time talking about reconciliation. That's hugely in the mix. We have, if folks remember back to the summer, the infrastructure bill that was negotiated both in the Senate and the House, that still has to kind of pass final muster and move forward. You mentioned the debt limit. In the continuing resolution, just to kind of fund the government in the regular way that kind of the government is funded. The continuing resolution is kind of the path forward that most people expect that the government will continue to be funded. There's obviously the traditional path of passing all the appropriations bills and that kind of stuff. That has not happened for quite some time. So I think everyone's just expecting a CR to happen. That's a must do. We have to fund the government. So I envision that will happen in any, whether it happens now this fall when it actually expires, or they do this thing that they frequently do called punt, which is just, pass something that extends it at the current level for 3 more months and then take it up a little bit later when the climate might be more favorable, or they might think that there's, maybe some different incentives bringing folks to the table. But that will get taken care of in some way. The debt limit, I think, is also, many argue, including some of my colleagues here at BPC, that is an imperative that has to happen. I think that because there's maybe a little bit of resistance amongst some Republicans to take that vote, I would anticipate you might see it packaged with something else. You might see it packaged with something that is considered a Republican priority or considered a must-do or something. So while they might not be super keen to vote on the debt limit part, the sum of the parts of the whole broader piece of legislation might bring them to the table enough to support it. All that's to be said, it's been a busy summer. It's going to be a really busy fall for Congress watchers. I think there's a lot going on, a lot both publicly and behind the scenes to kind of keep our eye on over these next couple of weeks, both within immigration policy and kind of the broader policy community.
Well, just one last thing, just before we close, just on the immigration side, I think one of the key things being that Afghan prioritization piece that Theresa mentioned. Is there bipartisan support for that among the membership? Do you think that gets included?
I'm hopeful for that. I think that we've seen that both amongst members of Congress and the broader population from kind of surveys and polls and things like that, there is a strong sentiment for wanting to help the Afghan refugees who helped our military and helped the United States during our time in Afghanistan. So I'm hopeful that there might be some kind of path forward there. I'm not sure exactly what vehicle it might be included on yet. Is it a continuing resolution? Does it go as maybe some kind of standalone bill? But I think the sentiment amongst members of Congress in a pretty bipartisan way has been wanting to help our Afghan allies.
Well, I'd like to say thank you to Sadikshya, Theresa, and Laura. Another great show in the books. And thank you to our listenership. One last reminder to rate, subscribe, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow us on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. I'm Blake Johnson. This Week in Immigration was created by Theresa Cardinal Brown. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Sadikshya Nepal, Theresa Cardinal Brown, and myself. Ethan Plotkin produces our show. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.